The world is going insane, and the scariest part is that no one notices. Every morning, you open your eyes, scroll past hundreds of faces, thousands of words, and everything seems to be shouting something. But if you listen closely, you will hear another kind of silence hiding beneath all that noise. The silence of minds that no longer think for themselves. People talk about freedom, yet they are afraid to stand alone. They talk about truth, yet only repeat what they heard from someone who seems more certain. The world keeps spinning, but inside a mad spiral, where reason is replaced by reaction, and faith becomes a commodity traded through fear. There are days when you look around and feel like the only one awake among a crowd, still dreaming. They laugh, they get angry, they argue, yet everything seems to be controlled by the same invisible thread. A new headline, a trend, a rallying cry, and millions instantly turn their eyes in the same direction. You try to speak differently, to ask a question, and you immediately feel the weight of suspicious stares. Why don't you think like everyone else? That question doesn't need to be spoken. You still hear it, whispering through every breath. So you stay silent, because in a mad world, awareness is a sin. Humans always pride themselves on being rational beings. We build enormous cities, create technologies that reach the stars, write philosophies that praise freedom and progress. But beneath that glittering surface, the herd instinct still lives, strong and primitive as it was thousands of years ago. We still fear rejection, still fear being left alone in the void. Deep inside, being different still feels like death. Like in the ancient times when being cast out from the tribe meant becoming prey. That is why we choose to believe what the crowd believes, do what the crowd does, and even love what the crowd loves. Not because it is right, but because it feels safe. Have you ever wondered when we stopped asking questions? When truth was replaced by majority? As a child, you asked why about everything. Why it rains, why people cry, why we must believe. But then you grew up and slowly learned that some questions are not allowed to exist. Asking too much makes others uncomfortable. Asking differently makes you look rebellious. So, you learn to stay quiet. Learn to live inside the frame. Learn to believe what others believe. And slowly, piece by piece, you disappear from yourself. Nothing is more dangerous than a crowd convinced it is wise. In the fever of collective madness, the blind are praised for shouting the loudest. The calm are doubted, the skeptics are punished, and the ones who truly understand are forgotten. We once told ourselves that the age of ignorance was over. But look around. Stupidity now holds degrees, microphones, and millions of followers. And whenever a different voice rises, the crowd rushes in, as if threatened by its very existence. They do not need to understand. They only need to destroy whatever makes them uneasy. Strangely, madness doesn't need to be loud. It seeps into the most ordinary things. A news article repeating the same idea 100 times. A conversation where everyone nods. A slogan printed on shirts and shared like truth. People think they are choosing, but in reality, they are only picking among the options laid out by others. What we call freedom is sometimes just a larger cage. Its bars painted the color of hope. Those who are still awake, if any remain, do not feel proud. They feel tired. Tired of watching a world drowning in illusion while believing it is enlightened. Tired of seeing that the more information people have, the less they understand. Tired of knowing that among the masses, the rarest thing is independent thought. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, they too wonder, am I wrong? Am I the lost one? Yet within all that confusion, one small thing keeps them grounded. The sense that truth, though buried, is still breathing somewhere. The world is not insane because liars exist, but because so many are afraid of the truth. Afraid that it will shatter the comfort they cling to. Afraid that if they face it, there will be no one left to blame. So they choose to live inside a safe bubble of shared belief, an illusion built from fear and sustained by the applause of those just like them. Perhaps what leads us most astray is not the lies of others, but the quiet complicity within each of us. When we see wrong and stay silent. When we know something is false but still share it, because everyone does. When we choose comfort over truth. Each time we do, a small piece of our reason is stolen, and we move one step closer to the edge of madness. But even in chaos, there are moments of awakening. It could be when you read a line, hear a word, or stand in a crowded street and suddenly realize you no longer want to pretend. A fleeting moment, yet it pulls you out of the invisible current, carrying everyone away, like a thin but real light, cutting through the dense fog of borrowed beliefs. In that moment, you no longer wish to shout, no longer need to prove anything. You simply want to stay silent and see everything as it truly is. And right there, the journey begins. The journey of a mind seeking freedom from collective madness. Someone once said, "Nothing is lonelier than waking up in a world still asleep." Yet in that loneliness, you finally have the chance to meet yourself again. Because sometimes, to truly see, you must step away from the crowd, even if it's just one small step. And when you dare to stop, while the world rushes toward the noise, you will hear something long forgotten, the quiet voice of your true self, rising gently amid the screams of millions. That is not the beginning of rebellion. That is the beginning of truth. Human beings are born carrying an ancient fear, the fear of being left behind. From the time of hunting and gathering, that fear was what kept us alive. A person separated from the tribe meant no one to protect them, no one to share food, no voice to answer in the dark. Through thousands of years of evolution, that fear did not disappear. It only changed its form. Today we no longer fear wild beasts, but we still tremble at the thought of being forgotten, laughed at, or called different. That is why, in what is called the Age of Freedom, people have become easier to control than ever. Notice that in every argument, what people seek is not truth, but agreement. Not everyone wants to understand. Most only want to belong to one side. They crave the feeling of being right, and the easiest way to achieve that is to stand with the crowd. We do not realize that when we fear isolation, we are willing to trade our reason for a sense of safety. Agreement becomes a kind of spiritual drug. The more we use it, the harder it is to quit. In the virtual world, where everyone has a voice but no one listens, the fear of being left behind becomes even more brutal. Every day, millions post the same ideas, the same tone, the same pre-programmed outrage. That sameness is no coincidence. It is the sign of a collective defense mechanism. If I speak like you, you won't hate me. If I think like your group, I'll be protected. And so we slowly lose the ability to tell the difference between what we truly believe and what we repeat just to be accepted. There was a story I once heard about a man living in a small town where everyone believed the nearby lake was cursed. They said whoever drank its water would go mad. One day, drought came, water ran out, and that man was the only one who didn't drink from the lake. But soon the whole town became strange. People laughed nonsense, acted erratically, and treated chaos as joy. The man tried to warn them, but no one listened. In the end, just to find peace, he bent down and drank a sip of the water. From that day on, everyone in town said he was normal again. That story is only a metaphor, yet it has never felt more true than in our time. When everyone believes the same thing, the one who speaks differently becomes the madman. When the world drinks from the same source of information, the one who keeps his reason is seen as the problem. This is the tragedy of the media age, where truth doesn't need to be accurate. It only needs to be repeated enough times to become real. It is easy to laugh at those who believe in the absurd, but if you look deeper, they are not so different from you. Everyone has their own source of water they drink from each day, whether it is the news, social media, an influencer, or even their own fear. We absorb words, images, and opinions until they become part of our identity. At that point, when someone questions us, we are no longer defending an idea, we are defending ourselves. And when identity feels threatened, we react as if our life is under attack. The paradox is that the more connected people become, the lonelier they feel. We live in an age of virtual communities, where one click can end a connection. Friendship, trust, and even morality have turned into temporary versions of themselves, lasting only until someone stops being popular. So the fear of rejection makes us cling harder to those who are like us. And from that, all difference starts to feel like danger. A child learns to stay silent when every question it asks is met with anger. An adult learns the same lesson, silence to survive. Not because they don't see the problem, but because they are tired of fighting against waves larger than themselves. Over time, that silence becomes a habit, then a norm. People no longer need to silence you. They only need to make you afraid to speak. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is when obedience is mistaken for virtue. When following the crowd is seen as civic responsibility. when silence is called respect, when doubt is labeled arrogance. Beautiful words are used to justify fear. And once fear wears the mask of morality, it becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. Yet there are still small moments, like cracks on a mirror. A casual conversation, a glance in the crowd, a question that slips out before being swallowed back. In those moments, something inside us stirs, a faint intuition that something is wrong. It is not loud or clear, just a whisper of feeling. Something isn't right. Most of us ignore it. But for a few, it becomes the starting point, the seed of awakening. They begin to observe, not to rebel, but to understand. They see how the stories society tells are built to fill emptiness. They see how fear is multiplied through every headline, every slogan, every post. And they begin to relearn a skill that should have been simple: thinking. Of course, when someone starts to truly think, they become suspicious. The crowd does not like anyone who sees the strings that control it. The one who speaks differently is called arrogant. The one who stands apart is called dangerous. But it is these people, the ones who don't fit in, who are the last hope of reason, because only they are willing to bear the loneliness of not belonging. The world will always need people like that. Not because they are more right, but because they dare to keep the flame of thought alive through the long night of conformity. However small, that light is the only thing that can remind us that darkness is not natural. It only exists because too many people turned off their lights at once. And perhaps, if you have ever felt different, ever felt lost, while everyone else nods in agreement, then you too carry that flame. Do not rush to extinguish it just because you fear being seen as different. Because maybe that small flame will be the very thing that keeps you from disappearing in the collective dream the world is so eager to follow. No one can wake the entire world, but one awakened soul can become a mirror that makes others start to look at themselves. And sometimes, a single honest look, a single sincere question, is enough to shake the thickest walls of illusion. The world does not need you to shout. It only needs you to look closely and not turn away. Every kind of delusion begins with fear. You don't need a dictator. You don't need a grand conspiracy. Just plant a little unease, and the crowd will take care of the rest. When people are afraid, they no longer need the truth. They only need a sense of safety. And in that moment, reason dies quietly. You have seen this before. You just didn't realize it. When a piece of news is repeated over and over, no matter how absurd, people begin to believe it. When the crowd shouts in unison with outrage, the silent ones become suspects. When someone dares to ask a question, instead of being heard, they are attacked. It seems that people no longer care what is true. They only care who is allowed to speak. And when the right to speak depends on the majority, truth has no chance to survive. In times like these, the world turns into a stage built on fear. News is no longer meant to inform, but to feed anxiety. Stories are exaggerated. Imaginary enemies are created. And slowly, we stop fearing what is real and start fearing what we ourselves have invented. Fear becomes an addiction because it gives us the illusion of control. People share information not because they trust it, but because they fear being the last to know. Every click, every rumor is a heartbeat of the collective sickness spreading through us all. But the most frightening thing is not the ones who spread fear. It is those who accept it obediently. A terrified crowd does not need a real enemy. They only need someone to point at. And once a target is found, peace returns, even if it's fake. That is why society always needs someone to blame. Because as long as we are busy hating someone else, we don't have to face ourselves. Once I heard a man say in a cafe, "I don't care what the truth is. I just want my side to win." It sounded like a joke, but it revealed the spirit of our age. We no longer seek truth, we seek victory. And to win, we are willing to trade intellect for applause, thought for belonging. That is the price the crowd will always pay, as long as it saves them from loneliness. Do you see now that the fear of loneliness is the energy that sustains every form of delusion? When the crowd looks in one direction together, they need no proof. They only need to know they are not alone. But that is the trap. Because while they find safety in the group, they lose their individual soul. A person stops asking questions, not because they are ignorant, but because they are tired. Asking means standing alone. And standing alone always hurts. Remember a moment in your life When everyone around you agreed on something that you knew in your heart was wrong, maybe it was in a meeting, a classroom, or a simple conversation, you stayed silent, not because you believed, but because you feared their eyes. And in that instant, you became part of the collective silence. A small piece of the wall of conformity. No one ordered you to be quiet, but you were. That is the power of fear. In the 1,950 seconds, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a famous experiment. He showed participants 3 lines, only one of which matched the sample. The correct answer was obvious. Yet when others intentionally gave the wrong one, most participants followed them, even knowing it was wrong. When asked why, they said, "I didn't want to be different." Just that much, and the world can collapse on the foundation of such obedience. Today, that experiment no longer sits in a lab. It happens every day, on social media, in the news, in our conversations. Every time we repeat an opinion without checking it, every time we click like because everyone else did, we join the same game. Gradually, the line between I think and they think disappears. At some point, we can no longer tell which voice is truly our own. The world is not short of intelligent people, but intelligence without courage is only a servant of fear. A person may read hundreds of books, hold countless arguments, yet the moment a contrary wind blows, they bow their head. Because knowledge is not freedom. Freedom comes only when you dare to think alone, even when it makes you tremble. If you are hearing these words and something inside you stirs, don't ignore it. Maybe you have stayed silent, looked away for peace, or compromised to avoid being disliked. But deep within you, there is still a part that refuses to sleep. The part that knows truth does not need approval from the crowd. Hold on to that part, no matter how small, no matter how fragile. It is the last piece of you that the crowd has not taken. And if you ever see someone being mocked for daring to ask why, don't turn away. Stay for a moment, because in that instant, you have a choice to make between the side of truth or the side of comfort. Sometimes a single look of empathy, a quiet, "I understand you," is enough to keep a soul from sinking completely into silence. If you feel this message, share it. Not as a slogan, but as a whisper that there are still people who remember how to think. Let someone, somewhere, hearing it, realize that they are not alone in humanity's trance. No one can wake the entire world, but one person who guards the light within can guide others toward their own. Because awakening does not begin with a shout, it begins with a small question in the heart. Is this really true? And when you are brave enough to hear the answer, you will see the world only goes mad when we stop looking for ourselves. But if you are still looking, still asking, then no matter how lost the world may be, you are the most awake soul in the room. When the crowd believes they are doing what is right, nothing can stop them from committing wrong. They can curse in the name of morality, punish in the name of justice, and silence every other voice in the name of truth. The irony is that in that collective madness, they feel awakened. The blindness of the crowd is always wrapped in noble words, for the common good, for safety, for a better future. But if you listen closely, you will hear what lies behind those slogans. Fear, the fear of being wrong, the fear of being alone, the fear of losing one's place in the herd. Once fear takes over, everything else becomes secondary. People no longer need evidence, only emotion. They do not need to understand the reason, only need someone to blame. And so, those who dare to be different become the new enemies, not because they are dangerous, but because they force the crowd to see its own weakness. When the crowd attacks, it is not attacking that person, it is attacking the reflection that makes it uncomfortable. History is filled with moments like that. Crusades launched in the name of God, ending in blood. Regimes built in the name of freedom, yet imprisoning thought itself. Revolutions for equality that burned those who dared to speak differently. In every era, when a group believes it holds the absolute truth, disaster begins, because truth never needs to be protected by destruction. Nietzsche once wrote, "Madness is rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, nations, and ages, it is the rule." That was not only philosophy, it was prophecy. The madness of the collective is unlike that of a single person. It has reasons, it has language, it even has ceremony. It can wear a suit, a crown, or sit in a meeting room. And the most dangerous thing is that it makes people believe they are sane. You can see it every day. On social media, in debates, where insults are called righteousness and humiliation is praised as courage. One person speaks differently, and hundreds rush in to condemn. No one asks, was he wrong? They only ask, which side is he on? In that moment, truth is replaced by allegiance, and once truth becomes a matter of sides, no one can see that they are lost. People are not foolish. They are tired. Tired of thinking, tired of doubting, tired of facing the complexity of the world. In that exhaustion, they crave a simple story, a neat explanation that helps them know where they belong. And that is the most fertile ground for collective madness, where simplicity is valued more than truth, and emotion replaces reason. When truth is twisted, society still functions, sometimes even more efficiently. People still work, still spend, still love and hate as usual. But something quietly shifts within the soul. Conversations become shallower. Doubt is treated as offense. And little by little, humanity loses its rarest skill, the ability to look inward. In such a society, the sane are no longer seen as wise. They are seen as troublemakers. They make others uneasy, and the crowd, in its effort to protect its false sense of peace, will try to silence them. The irony is that the crowd truly believes it is defending what is right. That is the peak of madness, when evil wears the mask of virtue, and no one can tell the difference anymore. I once saw an old friend turned away by his group just because he asked a question. Not a bold or offensive one, just a simple human question. Are we sure this is right? But that alone made him the thorn in their side. First came the uneasy glances, then the whispers, and finally isolation. One day he quietly left, and no one asked why. Later, when I met him again, he said, I realize they don't want truth. They want confirmation. I never forgot that sentence. Because it isn't just about one group, it's about our whole age. An era where people no longer seek truth, but agreement. Where value is not in what is said, but in how many agree with it. We live in the world of likes and shares, where truth is buried under the dust of reactions. The saddest part is that even those who see the truth often choose silence. They know that speaking up only brings trouble. They do not want to be the odd one out, the negative one, the strange one. And so, through the silence of the wise, the madness of the crowd is sustained. But there are still those who cannot stay silent. Not because they are braver, but because they can no longer stand pretending. They speak not to win, but to breathe. They stand not to change the world, but to keep from losing themselves. And in a world gone mad, even one person who dares to hold on to calm reason is already a revolutionary act. Perhaps every awakening begins in such a moment, when one person, just one, decides not to play the game anymore. They do not shout. They do not fight loudly. They simply stop. In the middle of the storm, they stand still. And in that stillness, they hear what the crowd can no longer hear, the sound of their own soul. Because in the end, the most frightening thing is not that the world has gone mad, but that we allow ourselves to be swept along with it. Once you stop asking questions, you become part of the trance. But if you still have a quiet space in your mind to ask, is this really right? Then no matter how mad the world becomes, you still have a way out. No madness ever begins overnight. It arrives slowly, quietly, like mist spreading through the streets before dawn. Everything starts with a faint feeling that something is off, a vague uneasiness in the chest, with no clear source, only the sense that the world has suddenly become hard to understand. And while people rush to find explanations, a story appears, simple, bright, easy to believe. An enemy is named, a cause identified, a solution shouted out loud. The crowd exhales in relief, as if they have finally found meaning for the chaos inside them. That is the first stage, the stage of disorientation. When the world changes too fast, when the old hasn't died and the new hasn't formed, people cling to anything that looks like order. They don't need truth, they need meaning. And when real meaning is gone, they settle for the cheapest version of it, a story easy to swallow, even if false. Then comes the second stage, simplification. A story repeated long enough leaves no room for nuance. Everything splits into black and white, us and them, right and wrong. The best storytellers never encourage thinking. They encourage feeling. Because emotions can move millions with just one slogan. When fear and anger combine, They become pure energy, the perfect fuel for any machine of power. After that comes the third stage, false consensus. When a story has been told long enough, silence turns into agreement. Those who doubt stay quiet, believing they are the minority. They look around, see everyone nodding, and think, maybe it's just me who feels something is wrong. The truth is, most people feel the same, but everyone waits for someone else to speak first. That is society's most subtle trick, making you believe others' silence means consent. From there to the fourth stage, violence is only a small step. Once the crowd believes they represent what is right, they are willing to do anything to protect it. They stop debating, they start punishing, they stop seeking understanding, they erase. A sentence taken out of context can destroy a life. A small doubt can become a crime. And the terrifying part is, they believe they are doing good. In history, every collective crime began with a similar line: we are only defending what's right. But like every intoxication, collective madness eventually faces a moment of sobriety. That is the fifth stage, awakening. No one knows exactly how it begins. Maybe when reality becomes too contradictory to ignore. Maybe when people grow tired of hating. Or simply when fear no longer has the strength to hold them. Awakening is not loud. It begins with a pause, when someone quietly asks, "Wait, are we sure about this?" And in that silence, the wall of consensus begins to crack. Truth has its own way of returning. It does not need force, only time. Lies may flourish for a season, but they can never survive reality forever. What is distorted eventually wears down under the weight of contradiction. When people begin to feel the conflict between what they see and what they are told, their minds start to tremble. A gap opens between two worlds, the world of illusion and the world of truth. That moment is painful, because to awaken, we must admit that we were once wrong. We must face the fact that we helped, even unknowingly, to uphold a lie. Some cannot bear that shame and return to their old dream, but others choose to move forward, learning to look at themselves again, not with judgment, but with understanding. That state is what people call the crack of the soul, when old beliefs collapse and expose the most fragile part inside. But it is in that place that new strength is born, because only when we stop believing blindly do we begin to truly search. A psychologist once said, "The survivor is not the strongest one, but the one who finds meaning in chaos." It carries the breath of Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps and discovered that a deep sense of meaning was what kept him from going mad in hell. Humans can endure almost anything, as long as they know why. And when the world falls into a trance, that why is the thread that keeps them tied to reality. Those who escape collective illusion are not necessarily smarter. They simply find an anchor within themselves, something that does not depend on outside noise. For one person, it may be philosophy. For another, faith, art, nature, or simply honesty with themselves. They begin to rebuild their world, not with delusion, but with awareness. And then, when they look around, they realize something beautiful. They were never as alone as they thought. Somewhere, among millions, other souls are awakening too, quietly, silently. They recognize each other not by words, but by the look in their eyes, because those who have awakened can always see those who are awakening. The world will never be free from illusion entirely. There will always be a part of humanity asleep and a part awake. But as long as there are people who keep the flame of awareness alive, darkness will never win completely. Because every time one person wakes up, the world grows a little brighter. Perhaps awakening is not the final goal, but the beginning of a longer journey, the journey of learning to stay awake in a world still dreaming. Because awakening does not separate us from humanity. It helps us see it more clearly, to see the fear, the pain, and the illusions that kept it alive. When we understand that, we stop judging. We simply see, and we know, everyone must walk through the dream, only at different times. Escaping the trance is not about running away from the world, but learning to stay with open eyes. When illusion collapses, the first thing you feel is not freedom, but emptiness. Without old beliefs, without familiar structures to lean on, you are like someone stepping out of a dark room after many years, blinded by the light of truth. It is the most fragile moment, when the mind can easily fall back into the old dream simply because truth feels too raw, too harsh. But if you dare to stay with it without fleeing, that emptiness will become the first ground on which a new life begins. The first step to remain awake is stillness. Not silence out of fear, but the silence of observation. When the world grows louder, only those who can be quiet truly hear. Step back and look at the flow of thoughts in your mind. Where do they come from? How many are truly yours, and how many are echoes of others? When you begin to ask that question, the mind starts to slow down. Ideas once considered absolute begin to crack. And through those cracks, something more real begins to show. The second step is emotional discipline. The madness of our age does not lie only in misinformation, but in overreaction. The crowd does not need reason, it needs emotion to be led. Every time we grow angry, fearful, or outraged, we become easier to control. Reducing reaction does not mean indifference. It means reclaiming ownership of the mind. Ask yourself, is this truly a threat, or does it only make me feel threatened? Just a small pause between stimulus and response is enough to open the door to freedom. The third step is rediscovering meaning. When collective beliefs collapse, we need a new anchor, and the only reliable one is the meaning we find for ourselves. It might be philosophy, faith, art, nature, or a task that makes you feel useful. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it is real, meaning something that cannot be bought or taken away. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." When you find your why, the world stops being frightening. The fourth step is building real connection. Awakening does not make you a loner. It helps you find the right people to walk with. Seek the souls who are also searching, those who ask questions, not to argue, but to understand. They may be few, but they are real anchors. In a world where everyone shouts to prove they are right, an honest and quiet conversation is the rarest treasure. A community of awakened people does not need to be the same. They only need to move toward the same light. And finally, the fifth step, the hardest one, is learning not to need the crowd. From childhood, we were taught that our worth depends on recognition, from grades and titles to the number of likes on a screen. But true freedom begins when you no longer need anyone to validate you. When you stop fearing being misunderstood or rejected, you become untouchable. Not because you are stronger, but because you have nothing left to lose. This is the stage where self-mastery becomes a quiet comfort. You no longer react with the crowd, no longer need to be right to be at peace. You just want truth with yourself, with others, with life. You learn to listen, not to reply, but to understand. You see the storm outside, yet inside you there is calm sea. I once thought freedom meant speaking what I believed. Now I know that true freedom is knowing when to stay silent. Silence is not weakness. It is no longer needing to prove, because those who are truly free do not need to win an argument. They only need not to lose their peace. And then one day, you realize the world is still as mad as ever. The news is still chaotic. People are still angry, still searching for someone to blame. But you are no longer swept along. You see it all, and you smile. Not the smile of cynicism, but the smile of one who has realized that peace does not depend on fixing the world. You may lose a few old friends. You may be called cold, distant, or strange. But the wonder is, when you stop needing to be understood, you begin to truly connect. Because only when we stop using the world to fill our inner emptiness can we love it as it is without demand, without expectation. Escaping the trance is not a victory. It is a return. A return to a clear mind and a quiet heart, able to feel without being consumed. Then you will see that every fear that once imprisoned you, the fear of being hated, isolated, or wrong, was never real. They were illusions you believed for too long. And when those illusions fade, only one thing remains presence. You no longer need to escape the mad world, because you no longer belong to it. Not in separation, but in transcendence. Like someone standing on the shore watching the river rush by, knowing it still flows, but no longer being carried away. That is the moment of freedom. Not loud, not triumphant, just a deep breath in silence. And from that breath arises a question, the simplest yet the deepest of all. Now, how shall I live? Because awakening, if it ends at awareness, is only halfway. The real path begins when you learn how to live awake in a world still dreaming. There comes a moment on the journey of awakening when language no longer feels enough. Not because you cannot speak, but because every word seems too small beside the clarity unfolding within you. You suddenly realize you no longer need to convince anyone, no longer need to prove anything. The world that once made you furious, that once drove you to shout for change, now feels like a mirror reflecting how far you've come in seeing yourself. Awakening does not make you a saint. It simply makes you more honest, more bare. You see in yourself the very things you once despised in others: fear, pride, the need to be loved, to be understood. And when you no longer want to deny that, you begin to understand why people fall so easily into illusion. Because each of us has been blind. The only difference is that some stop long enough to notice, while others keep running so they don't have to see. True freedom is not about resisting the crowd, but about not needing the crowd to exist. You can still walk among people, hearing laughter, arguments, and the endless noise of a world spinning in its fever, yet inside, you are still. Not because you don't care, but because you are no longer pulled along. You no longer react to every absurdity as before, not because you are indifferent, but because you understand that madness no longer belongs to you. At that point, you begin to feel a new kind of solitude. No longer the loneliness of being left behind, but the solitude of one who has stepped out of the crowd and is now looking back. That solitude no longer hurts. It becomes clear and light, a quiet space where you can breathe and hear yourself without fear of being drowned out. It is the solitude of a free soul. Kierkegaard once said, "The crowd is untruth." At first, the words may sound bitter, but as you live, you begin to see he wasn't calling for isolation, but for a return to one's own center. Because, as long as you need others to reflect who you are, you remain bound by the distortion of their mirrors. But when you look directly, without reflection, you return to pure knowing, a place beyond argument, beyond the need to be right. In that moment, you understand what the wise have always said: truth does not need protection. It defends itself through presence. You do not need to shout against falsehood, only to live in truth. You do not need to react to evil, only to act with goodness. You do not need to condemn lies, only to speak what is real. For truth is not something spread through noise, but through the way we exist. When a person is truly awake, they no longer need to speak loudly. They simply exist, and that presence alone stirs something in others. Not persuasion, but resonance. Not victory, but remembrance. They do not try to awaken anyone, but the light in them quietly reminds others that such light exists. And so, one by one, other souls begin to stir. That is how every true revolution begins, not with weapons or slogans, but with the quiet spreading of awareness. A person who is awake resists illusion, not through argument, but through being beyond control. No one can dominate a mind that understands itself. No one can silence a person who no longer fears being misunderstood. And no one can extinguish a soul that knows its peace does not depend on any power outside itself. Life then becomes strange. You still work, speak, love, get disappointed, laugh, and cry. But everything happens from a different depth, a silent layer within. What once kept you awake at night now only makes you sigh. What once made you argue now only makes you smile, not because you are wiser, but because you no longer need to pull the world toward your side. You let it be. And in that acceptance, you find peace. You will lose many things: old people, old beliefs, even the old image of yourself. But every loss is only a layer that was ready to fall away. What remains is not emptiness, but lightness, a space where truth can breathe. And in that space, you realize truth was never out there. It has always been here, waiting for you to pause long enough to see. By now, you no longer need to ask, how do I escape the collective trance? Because escape does not mean running away from the crowd. It means no longer being consumed by it. You look at the world and understand that everyone is on their own journey. Some are still asleep, some are dreaming, and some are just waking up. No one is higher or lower, only at different moments of the same great dream. And with that understanding, your heart softens. The anger fades. The contempt disappears. What remains is compassion, not pity, not sentimentality, but the deep knowing that we are all learning to see, all learning to awaken. You begin to live as an ordinary person, yet every gesture, every word carries the clarity of someone who has walked through the dark and returned to the light. The world will stay noisy, chaotic, sometimes cruel, but within you, there is now a place untouched by the madness of mankind. a place of truth, of stillness, of freedom. And from that place, you no longer need to hide. You can walk through the storm without fear, because you know the storm exists only outside. In the end, you realize awakening is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a new way to live. A way of living where you no longer idealize the world, nor despair over it. You simply live with clear presence, a bright heart, and a free mind. Because once you have seen, you can never unsee. And from that moment on, every breath is freedom. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.